Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video I wanted to talk about some NBA free agents that still have not signed with the team. And this seems to happen every single year where there are guys that just slip through the cracks, even though they're really not that much worse than some players that even signed on day one of free agency. For whatever reason, whether it be maybe a poor season the year before or age or some injury issues, a lot of guys just don't end up getting signed until later in the offseason or maybe even potentially mid-season. We just saw this with Kyle Korver, who wasn't technically a free agent this offseason, but he got traded a couple of times and then was bought out and ended up signing in Milwaukee just a couple of days ago as of this recording. So let's take a look at some other NBA free agents that still haven't been signed but could be over the next couple of weeks. First up is Lance Stephenson, and this is certainly a polarizing player, and it's not a great sign that the team that he played for last year in the LA Lakers didn't decide to bring him back, at least to this point, because they certainly are a team that could have used a little bit more depth on the perimeter, similar to how they signed him last offseason. But I'm not quite giving up on his chances to be signed this offseason or maybe a little bit into the season quite yet, because he is still a serviceable offensive player, playmaker, shot creator, even though you do have to give him a little bit more control when he's on the floor than maybe you would like to, and he does make some plays that aren't going to always be the smartest things in the world. He is still, as you can see by his stats last season, a serviceable player, someone that can help a team, and I wouldn't be shocked if we get into maybe the first couple weeks of the season or maybe even just, into training camp, and a team realizes that they need a little bit more shot creation, they need a little bit more offense, and Lance Stephenson is a guy that they think of and try and bring in, even just on a trial basis. So it is a little bit surprising that he hasn't been signed yet given his offensive skill, but at the same time, when you consider some of his issues and maybe how his season went in LA last year, it also isn't all that surprising that he is still one of the NBA free agents that has not yet been signed. Moving on now, and this is another big one, and it's J.R. Smith, formerly of the Cleveland Cavaliers. And this has been a little bit of a weird situation because his contract technically ran through this season. He technically would have been a 2020 free agent, but the way that his contract was structured, pretty much everybody knew that he would end up being a free agent in this particular offseason because the Cavs would buy him out, which they did recently, but it still there haven't really been any rumblings about him signing with a team quite yet. But when he does, I personally think he's still going to be a good player for somebody, even though he didn't really play that much this past year for a number of different reasons. If you go back 2 years and look at his stats, he's still a good shooter. He's still a good volume three-point shooter, and those guys are always valuable to a team, even though he's not a very good defender anymore and is certainly getting up there in age. He's somebody that's going to be at the top of the pile when teams are looking at potentially injury replacements, or again, maybe they get to camp and they realize that they need a little bit more offense, they need a little bit more shooting. J.R. Smith is going to be somebody that teams are going to look at, whether it be the Lakers or maybe even the Bucks get more shooting, maybe the Sixers get more shooting. He's only really been a free agent for about a week or so at this point, so I would not be surprised at all if J.R. Smith ends up signing before the season actually starts, and he's another guy to take a look at that hasn't been signed yet, but probably will be either at the beginning of the season or maybe a couple weeks into it. Next up now is Kenneth Faried, formerly of the Houston Rockets. And this is a player that really hasn't had a good season by his standards in a couple of years. It was a salary cap dump last offseason when he went from Denver to Brooklyn and then was bought out and played with Houston the last second half of the year or so. It was actually really good for them, and I think this could start to be maybe a bit of a bounce back for him if he can just land on a team. I still think he's someone that can provide energy, effort, rebounding, some scoring in the paint, rim running, not a whole lot else, and not someone that has great size either, but I still think that he has value to a team as just a high energy guy, a great locker room guy. By all reports, he was good in Houston and Brooklyn in terms of with his teammates. He's a guy that just can kind of help you get through the long regular season. And again, post-injury, if one of the big guys on a certain team gets injured, Kenneth Faried's name is going to be near the top of the list in terms of a possible injury replacement, just like he came in and helped Houston last season as a backup big rim runner, things like that. So another guy to keep an eye on as potentially a big guy to be signed as a free agent that hasn't been signed yet. Moving on now to a player that I'm really not all that optimistic about, and that is Pau Gasol. He didn't play a ton last year, started off with the Spurs, was bought out, and then ended up signing in Milwaukee. Didn't play a ton for them, and I'm really hoping that the team ends up giving him a chance and he can play at least one more season if he wants to, but I also wouldn't be surprised if the now 39-year-old ends up going into retirement either. But if you go back and look at his stats from 2 seasons ago, he is still a good player and someone that can provide you good minutes as a big, just not necessarily someone that's going to be doing it for 20 to 25 minutes a game, and not someone that's going to be doing it as an outstanding defender, obviously, at this point in his career, but as a solid presence in the paint, someone that can score inside, hit an occasional jump shot, still a good passer, still a great veteran and locker room presence. Someone that, again, I wouldn't be surprised necessarily to sign a deal, but I'm not as optimistic about him as some of the other guys on this list, given his age and just given the fact that he might be ready for retirement as well. But Pau Gasol is another really good NBA player that has not been signed yet as a free agent. Next up is the player that I'm probably most surprised hasn't found a team yet, and that is Iman Shumpert, formerly of the Houston Rockets, just like Kenneth Faried, because he was actually a really critical part of what the Kings were doing early last season as a 3-and-D player around guys like Buddy Hield, De'Aaron Fox, and Marvin Bagley, and someone that just provided that team a lot of confidence and just was really important to those young guys. And I was a little bit surprised that they ended up moving him mid-season the way that they did. And then when he moved to Houston via trade, he just wasn't as good of a player as he was early season in Sacramento, struggled a little bit with his shot, was still valuable for them, but not as valuable as he was in Sacramento. But I would be really surprised if Iman Shumpert doesn't end up finding a team either before the season or at some point mid-season. Again, if somebody gets hurt, his name is going to be at the top of the list as a potential replacement. He's never going to be an above average 3-point percentage guy, but is just valuable to your team as an energy guy, as a locker room guy. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him find a similar role on a young team as he did for the Kings last season, as a little bit of a mentor and, again, a 3-and-D player that can kind of help and be a complementary option around some of your other younger stars. Maybe a team like Atlanta, maybe a team like Dallas that needs a little bit more help on the wings could potentially look at Iman Shumpert as an option, and again is another relatively big name free agent that has not yet been signed. Moving on now is a player that became a salary cap casualty for the Golden State Warriors, and that is multiple-time NBA champion Shaun Livingston. And it would be actually really interesting for me to see him play with a team that is not Golden State, just to see if he could survive on a team that doesn't surround him with so many good shooters to counteract his biggest weakness, which is that he doesn't shoot as a perimeter player. He's getting up there in age, but he's still a good veteran, locker room presence, a still pretty good defender at this point in his career, and has kind of a strange set of skills that could end up actually helping a team from a mid-range scoring standpoint, and just size at the guard position. Now, I wouldn't expect him to play a big role on any team should he end up being signed, and I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't sign at all and end up just retiring this offseason. Given his injury history and the major knee injury that he suffered earlier in his career, wouldn't be surprised if he decided to just hang it up on a high note after his very successful era with the Golden State Warriors. But Shaun Livingston is another guy to look out on and say, hey, maybe he's someone that can help a team, and he's still unsigned as a free agent as a result of being bought out by the Warriors this offseason. And last up now is Joakim Noah, and I will freely admit I thought this guy was washed up. I didn't think that he was really going to play any more meaningful minutes in his career going into last season after what was a pretty big debacle in New York, signing the contract that he did, suffering injury issues pretty much immediately, having a bit of a power struggle or clashing with the head coach and Jeff Hornacek. That was just a complete dumpster fire of a situation for him initially in New York, and that combined with his injury issues and just not being as effective of a player, I never really thought that he was going to get another chance in the NBA, but he ended up getting one in Memphis last year. And again, I will completely admit I was surprised, and I was wrong in saying that he was completely done as an NBA player. He was good for Memphis. He wasn't outstanding or anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but he was a really good backup big for them, showed off that passing skill, showed off a little bit of the defensive ability that he was known for so well in the beginning of his career, scored a little bit as well. And again, just like Kenneth Faried, just like Pau Gasol, if a big guy gets hurt, his name is going to be at the top of the list in terms of players that could potentially be brought in. Now, on the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he doesn't end up signing a deal, given all the issues that I talked about earlier with his injury issues, some issues that he had in New York and things like that. But if Memphis can find minutes for him and he can play that well for them, maybe they end up bringing him back, or maybe that's enough to convince another team that maybe he can help them as well, again, maybe post-injury. So I wouldn't be surprised if he goes completely unsigned, but I also wouldn't be surprised if a team ends up bringing him in either this offseason or training camp or midseason, and he's pretty productive for them. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Quick reminder, I know that the podcast, the Sporting Logically podcast, has been out of commission here for the last couple of weeks. I've been way too busy So much stuff going on, but it is back up, and I just put up an episode today. So if you missed that, or you haven't seen it, or you just forgot about the podcast because it's been a couple of weeks, I apologize, but it is up and the link is down in the description. So be sure to check that out. But once again, my name is Tucker. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.